on Webex for BroadWorks. We're excited to have you here, whether you're watching live or you're joining us later through the recording. Excited to have John Chleboun here as we go through this material, as he's been working on this for quite some time and working through a lot of the interesting questions that come up from different clients on this. So I see folks are continuing to join, so we'll go ahead and get started with a bit of an introduction about who we are and what we're trying to accomplish here before I hand it over to John. So ECG is a company that makes the network work. We're an engineering team, a small company, and focused on the collaboration space, especially voice service providers, internet service providers, and associated operations. A lot of our projects involve the RFI, RFP process of recommending and selecting. We do a lot of work on configuration of the network, integration and remediation of questions and integration challenges, acceptance testing, which includes compliance. We work substantially on the legal and cybersecurity issues, and then training and operations to help voice and data teams, whether that's meetings and collaboration, but also data teams, including enterprise data and internet service provider data, and help those teams be successful, well-trained, and be able to operate their systems independently. And we've got a handful of our clients who have taken advantage of training or integration or all of the above listed here on this slide. So our presenter today is John Chleboun. He is one of our senior members of technical staff, which means he's completed a pretty extensive training and experience program, including research projects in that. He held a master's degree and a bachelor's as well. He's been in engineering at ECG since 2010. Clients include, some of his recent clients include Vonage, University of Virginia, Momentum Telecom. He's also done work with the U.S. Department of Justice and TPX. TPX is incidentally the largest Webex for BroadWorks deployment that I'm familiar with. He's based in Durham, North Carolina, where he lives with his family. So welcome, John. Thanks for doing this work and presenting for us today. Before you get started, I will say you guys can ask questions in the chat or the Q&A window, and we'll cover these at the end of our time and keep track of those questions. But please go ahead and send the questions in as you think of those questions as we're going along. Welcome, John.
Great, thanks, Mark. I appreciate the introduction. So the reason that we're here today is to try to reduce your pain as you are rolling out Webex for BroadWorks. I want to try to give you a heads up on some of the tough parts, some of the places where you might get tripped up. We don't want you to be blindsided halfway through, so that's why we're here, is to give you some heads up. Like Mark said, please do ask questions. We'll try to answer those, and yeah, we will give you guys the slides after the fact. We'll make those available as well. So yeah, we're here because Webex is it's a pretty cool thing, and BroadWorks is a pretty cool thing. So let's use them together. What the Webex for BroadWorks solution gives us is your BroadWorks identity on all these different clients, mobile, tablet, PC, and then in that same app, in general and almost completely now, giving you also Webex meetings, messaging, spaces, sharing, all this in the same app. So it gives you a lot of really well thought out and well implemented Webex features as well alongside your BroadWorks identity. Also gives you some cool things like visual voicemail for your BroadWorks voicemail. And just like you could with the UC1 Connect apps, you can manage a lot of your BroadWorks settings as well through the Webex for BroadWorks app. And I mean, if we're going to be real about it, there also is another large driver for why we're here. But we'll just leave it at that. And yeah, it's a great app, and we're gonna make it go well. So these are the kind of the categories of things that we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to talk about the concepts. Then we're going to talk about some of the snags. And here's what I mean by snags. So I like to trail run. I like to run on trails, and as I'm getting towards the end of my run, oftentimes I'm tired, I'm not paying attention, I'm not picking my feet up, and those little rocks and roots that weren't a problem before, all of a sudden I can catch my feet on those and I end up face down on the ground. So that's the idea here, is I want to call out some of those snags so that you guys don't end up on the ground when you're going through and deploying Webex for BroadWorks. And then finally, I'll give you some resources, mostly a lot of links that should be helpful as you're getting into this process. So yeah, starting off with the concepts, we'll talk about the XSPs, NPS, and Authentication Service. First off, the architecture requirements for Webex for BroadWorks. Cisco strongly recommends dedicated Webex XSPs, or you can use ADPs as well. The one thing that's very key with this is that the authentication service, which we'll talk about in a second, it must be co-resident with the XSI applications so that the long-lived tokens can work. But this is an example architecture that Cisco gives us. There's a little bit of variability in there, but kind of the key thing is that we've got a dedicated Webex XSP here, and then also an NPS XSP. So Cisco is saying the NPS has no other XSP or ADP applications on it. It's only an NPS. The idea here is that you don't want anything choking out and causing delays for the push notifications in your network. It's just a reminder here that these XSPs really are call processing. These really are central to the processing of calls now, whereas years in the past, they kind of were in a different category as far as redundancy goes. But these are really runtime servers right now that we have to treat them as such. One other note is that each AS has exactly one NPS cluster. Right now, there's no way to split out a separate Webex NPS. So that's something to be thinking about as you're rolling this out. The authentication service, it's an application that's hosted on the XSP that you might not have yet in your network. So what this is doing is it enables and allows Webex Cloud to authenticate the Webex common identity users against your BroadWorks platform. It does that with the auth service application. There are two authentication methods, Cisco CI token validation or mutual TLS. The Webex for BroadWorks Solutions guide goes through both, but it definitely recommends the Cisco CI token validation. That's kind of the recommended or main way of rolling this out. And those procedures are fairly straightforward, not too bad, but that's one that you may not yet have in your network. Let's talk about NPS proxy a little bit. So previously, this is the network push service architecture that probably I would guess that most of you service providers have in your network. And kind of some of the keys here are looking at the fact that on your NPS you have the push notification certs and keys for your apps loaded up on your NPS, and it goes off and it uses those keys with APNS for Apple and Firebase for Google push notifications. So there's a security issue there, having those push notification private keys with the service providers. And so to address that, Cisco has rolled out this NPS architecture, NPS proxy architecture. So the way this works is that the NPS, it has a trust relationship with, like our NPS at the service provider has a trust relationship with the NPS in the Cisco cloud. And so every hour or so or less, our NPS goes and gets short-lived tokens that it can then use when it is authenticating with Apple APNS and with Google Firebase Cloud. And so NPS proxy is required for Webex for BroadWorks. This is something that needs to be rolled out and needs to be configured in your NPS when you are doing this. It's a requirement of Webex for BroadWorks. One key, we're getting a preview of some of the snags here. One key is FCM v1. That's the protocol that's used for dealing with the Android push notifications. Check and see if your NPS has v1 enabled. If it does, you're great. If it's false and this NPS is shared with other mobile applications, other UCO and Connect or other branded applications, the migration from FCM to FCM v1 is, I say fun in quotes. If you look at this diagram and you start to get dizzy, I think that's a pretty accurate reaction to that. So there's a link here to go and digest and understand that procedure, but that's going to be a challenge to migrate from FCM to FCM v1. Just be aware of that if that's true for you. Continuing on in the concepts, we have Partner Hub and Control Hub. So this is Partner Hub. This is just a little screenshot of what it looks like there. So Partner Hub this is the portal that we are going to use as service providers to manage Webex entities, and then also the connections with your BroadWorks platform. It's just admin.webex.com, log in there after you've got your credentials set up with the account team. This is, like I said, this is what we log in as service providers to be able to manage lots of things at that level. The concept to be aware of is a cluster. So these are BroadWorks platforms. This is the connection between the Cisco Webex Cloud and your BroadWorks platform. Another concept to start to become aware of is called a customer. So these are your customers as they are represented in Webex. Somewhat analogous to a BroadWorks enterprise. You can kind of think of it in that way. Another concept to understand is called a template. This is a relationship that defines how the customers and the Webex users are going to be automatically provisioned, what they're going to look like when they are provisioned. And so there's various settings in there that you can set up for the kind of the default on what they look like when they get automatically provisioned. That's what a template is. This is also where you can control lots of things around branding and where you can manage your administrators, the Webex users that have the administrator privileges within Partner Hub or Control Hub. So let's talk about Control Hub. So this is what kind of the landing page of Control Hub looks like. This is the portal to look at Webex users and entities for each customer. So this is a level down, and you notice the URL is actually the same here. Your user admin account, the privileges determines where you end up. If you're a partner level admin, then you end up in Partner Hub. If you're customer level, you end up in Control Hub. You can actually give, as a service provider, you can give your customers access to view and manage some of these things if you choose to. At the Control Hub level, oh, and I'll note that there is a way to get from Partner Hub over into Control Hub for a particular customer. So you would drill down for a particular customer into Control Hub. So here in Control Hub, we manage our users, we manage devices, several different security type things are managed here. Customer level branding, so there's partner level branding and then also customer level branding. SSO, if some of your customers are using SSO to log in, claiming domains, we'll get into a little bit of what that is later. And then also troubleshooting. Within the Webex app, there's a little button that says send logs, and it says, okay, yes, I sent logs. And where did they go? Well, they went here, they went to Control Hub, and you can find that user in the troubleshooting section and get those logs to either look at yourself or to pass them on to Cisco Tech. Yeah, so that's Control Hub and Partner Hub. Main recommendation I would give you here is to just dig in, get access, get set up with Cisco, dig in and start to understand it, and just get a feel for where things are and how the various entities work together. It just takes experience getting in and doing it. Let's talk about how we have two users. Each human now in this world is going to be two users. On the left here, we've got my user in Webex in Control Hub. Excuse me. And then on the right, we've got my user in BroadWorks. So I'm in two places in order to make this work. So if we're a BroadWorks service provider, how do we get the Webex user into Webex Control Hub? We can go in and pointy clicky or CSV import users into Control Hub. I would definitely not recommend that. The next three options are definitely where I would go. This is a very key decision point as you're getting into this to decide how you want to roll this out for your users. So option number one would be the REST API. You can integrate it with your OSS and BSS systems if you have those systems and the development capabilities to do that. You can do all kinds of fun and custom things to get the users built into Control Hub whenever you want to. And then I've got some links there that you guys will have in the slides for how you can dig in and look at what those APIs look like and what you can do there. You can use flow-through provisioning, which I've had good success with this as well. What happens here is you have on the application server, it has a provisioning adapter, a little applet that runs, and it is the thing that makes the API calls to provision the Webex users for you. And what the trigger for that is to assign and turn on the integrated IMMP service to a particular BroadWorks user. And it looks at that user's email address, and it uses that to then go and configure that user within Webex. And it goes in it does it for you. So it works pretty well. Then you also have a user self-activation option as well. So if you set this up, there will be a provisioning link that you have in Partner Hub in the template. Remember, the template is the thing that defines how users are auto-generated and what they look like when they are generated. So you have this link that's in the template. You can distribute that link to your users, and however you want to distribute that. Your users will follow that link, and it will walk them through the process and get them provisioned up within Webex and get that connection made. Kind of the key here is that these users also need to be in BroadWorks. Remember the authentication service, it's linked there. So they cannot self-activate if they are not in BroadWorks. And Webex is looking at the user's email address field in the BroadWorks user. We'll go back up here. You can see the email field is important here for this. And it's also looking at the alternate user ID. That's another way that you can make that connection there. So whatever the user logs into, whatever email address the user uses to log into Webex, that either needs to be in the email address field in the BroadWorks user or as an alternate user ID in BroadWorks. Moving on in the concepts, let's talk about the Webex app and the lifecycle of the Webex apps. We'll compare this to previous experience that most of us have in branding UC1 Connect apps. In one sense, this is great. Webex, it's an app. Well, it's two apps now, including the meetings on the iStore or on the Apple and Google Play Store. Then on the PC, it's a unified app. It's moving to be one unified app, but these apps are managed by Cisco. Your users will go to the app stores and they'll download them, or to the Cisco Webex website, and they'll download this app and they'll be off and running. So we can take this analogy it's kind of like sitting in the back seat on a road trip, just like this stylish gentleman is here. You don't have to plan the route. You don't have to drive. You don't really even have to stay awake. And the car will go somewhere. It'll go. That's really what we're stepping into for the Webex app lifecycle. It can be that's really great. We don't have the periodic branding updates to get the new features. We don't have to have the App Store accounts, all those privacy policies, like we talked about with the NPS. We don't have to have the keys, the push keys anymore. That doesn't mean that we're completely off the hook, though. Testing is still required on this. And so the benefit here that we're getting from Cisco managing these apps is that they're rolling out new features. They're testing these new releases at a fairly rapid pace. They're actively improving and developing these apps. We don't have to do that. The cost is that it is possible. There have been bugs. There can be bugs in these apps. And kind of the main cost here is that we find these, especially when we're talking about the Apple and the Google Android apps, we find these apps at the same time that our users get these apps. And so we find these bugs we could find these bugs at the same time that our users find these bugs, or worst case, we're finding them after our users find these bugs. We do have a little bit of control over the desktop app releases, but just the way the iOS and Android app stores are implemented, we don't have any control over that. So I think a thing that is really important to wrap our minds around is to get in sync with the monthly cadence for the feature releases that the Webex app is running through. Generally, I'll show you some ways to keep on top of when that's going to drop in the future, but generally about 10 days into the month. And to download it and to test it, run it through your regression tests to make sure that there aren't any bugs that are affecting your particular implementation. If you do find a bug or an issue, open tickets quickly. Cisco, when working with them, Cisco have been responsive to that. They can and have pulled releases from the app stores when there have been issues. And so they, like I said, they are responsive there, have a good relationship with your account team and with TAC, and bring it up with them quickly. And like I said, they've been interested in this being good and dealing with issues if there have been. But most of the time, yeah, we can sit back and enjoy the ride. So we've covered some concepts. Next, we're going to move over to some of the snags. We're going to move over to some of the snags that we can run into as we're walking through this process. Something to be aware of here is that there are two different types of directory synchronization that you may run into. And one is spelled with a Z, one is spelled with an S. So this is directory synchronization number one. This one is talked about in the Webex for BroadWorks Solutions Guide. We have, just a little note on what it looks like in the guide. And then on the right side over here, this is what it looks like in Partner Hub, configured in the template. In Partner Hub, it's a little bit more helpful in that it directly says BroadWorks directory sync, but in the documentation, it's named the same as the second type of directory synchronization. What this is, what Webex BroadWorks directory sync is similar to enterprise directory, but what it's doing is Webex users in the app, if this is turned on, Webex users in the app can search by name or by number for other BroadWorks users who are not also Webex users. So of course they can search all the other Webex users in that particular customer, but this is allowing them to search users in BroadWorks as long as they have a telephone number in that BroadWorks enterprise, but who don't yet have Webex or who will never have Webex. And so it expands the capabilities of the search within the app. This directory sync, it syncs up weekly by default. It can be configured by Cisco to run daily if you ask them to. There's kind of a little catch on that the app can cache for 72 hours, so it may not show up immediately there. And I believe there's also on the roadmap or coming soon the ability to push a button and have it sync on command as well. But this is definitely a helpful feature. Uses the CTI interface as well, and can definitely add value, especially if you have kind of a mixed environment where your customers have some users with Webex and some users without Webex. This allows them to see and search through the users that they expect to be able to see. The snag part of it is that there's a second directory synchronization, and this is in Control Hub. Under the organization settings, you'll find this section where you can try to, or perhaps you need to talk to Cisco to turn on directory synchronization. This is completely different. This is related to the Cisco Directory Connector, which is an app that runs locally on your network or on your customer's network. And it's going to be doing things, syncing LDAP, Active Directory, or systems like that to manage Webex CI users. And so this is something that you may want to, your customers may want to implement this to keep their Webex users up to date and synced with LDAP or Active Directory. You may choose to do that. But this is totally separate from the what is a lot like the enterprise directory that we just talked about. So that's a snag to be aware of, that those two are completely separate, even though they are named very similarly. And this one's just not referenced in the Webex for BroadWorks Solutions guide. It's kind of a more general Webex feature. Another snag that is important to talk about here. So the background here is that if you, without any BroadWorks account, you can take your email and your Gmail or whatever, and go and sign up for Webex, and you can get a Webex account. You'll have basic Webex calling meetings. You can join meetings through that. You'll be able to send messages to people, kind of have the basic functionality there. You won't be able to host meetings or anything like that, but you'll have some decent functionality there. And so some of your users may have done this already, and they may have happened to use the email address that you're planning to configure them as a Webex for BroadWorks user in the future. So if someone goes and configure or signs up themselves for Webex, they're going to end up in the free account customer within Webex. They have that set up there just to facilitate those basic features. They're not going to end up in your customer, customer within Webex, and that's what I'm calling purgatory here. So they're already provisioned. They're over off to the side in a different customer organization. They're not in your customer organization. So then when you go and try to configure them and provision them in your customer organization, you're going to get an error. Say, no, sorry, this email address is already associated with a different user that's not in your customer. I can't do this. They already have an account. It's not in your customer organization. There is a process that you can walk through to claim users. That's this diagram here, and then there's a link that you guys will have soon as well that you can look at how that works. Some of the keys there are to be able to verify and claim the email domain, the domain that you're using, to be able to, so that Webex can trust you, that's you have the ability to do that. You can go and you can claim them, and then also you can claim the user and you can claim the domain to ensure that in the future, people don't go and create free users using that domain that you want to associate with Webex for BroadWorks. They won't be able to end up in the free account customer and get in purgatory in that way. So those are two concepts to definitely be aware of, and to plan out how you want to deal with that particular case so that you don't end up with a lot of users over in purgatory. Another snag that you can run into is a little bit of an interesting choice for the default calling behavior. I think it's related to the fact that Webex is a much bigger app than just the Webex for BroadWorks functionality, but here's a way to make it work a little bit better for Webex for BroadWorks. So the default calling behavior in the Webex app is to have the call go out as a Webex Teams call if you are calling another Webex user, even if that other Webex user is part of your Webex for BroadWorks customer organization. And so what that does is it bypasses BroadWorks completely. It means that that call does not hit your BroadWorks platform at all. It just goes directly through the Webex cloud to complete. That means that the implication of that is that you don't have any of your BroadWorks features for that call that you're used to or interested in having: voicemail, call recording, It can give you, possibly even have lawyers involved if you don't change this, because it would bypass things like lawful intercept or records, compliance, number porting, all that kind of stuff comes into play with that call flow that you might be bypassing what you need to be doing there. But thankfully, this is, you can change this. You can change the order that those options show up for your users in the mobile apps. And you can even hide Webex Teams call, as you can see on the right here, that we've done here. So in this particular case, the call options will always be steered through BroadWorks because we don't have the option to do just a Webex Teams call. So for this particular setup that you can see here, all calls are going to go in through BroadWorks and use all the BroadWorks features. And this can be changed in Control Hub for the particular customer. There's a note here on how to get there. I call this Snag Ask Cisco for the cheat codes. The reason here is that so as you're navigating around Partner and Control Hub, there can be times where you are reading about a feature in the solutions guide and it's just not appearing, or it's not appearing as you expect it to. There are some features that have switches that need to be flipped behind the scenes by Cisco to enable them and to allow you to see them. Some of them being kind of more advanced customization features, or maybe they're a little bit newer in the development cycle on the Cisco side. One example here being this advanced branding example that I've run into just recently. Over here on the left, this is how the branding section in Partner Hub looked, and then working with the Cisco account team or the CSE, that toggle behind the scenes was flipped, and so now we have the advanced customization options over here, and so that view just changed from left to right after they were setting things on the back end. So again, have a good relationship with your Cisco team, with your technical team, and work with them, talk with them about how, if you're not seeing something that you expect to be seeing, it's possible that they need to configure something for you and for your partner on the back end. We've gotten through the concepts. We talked about the NPS, Authentication Service, Partner Hub and Control Hub, the differences there. Again, the key there is getting in and having time with it and understanding it. We have talked about Webex users and BroadWorks users, how those are two entities for one human, and how you can manage those, how you can provision those. Webex app lifecycle, how we get to be along for the ride, and also how we can guard against if there are bugs. We talked about the snags for directory integration, directory synchronization, sorry, the two different types there, and being aware of that. User purgatory, how users can end up in the free customer organization and how you can get them back if you need to. Default calling behavior, and then asking Cisco for the cheat codes if you see something, or if you don't see something that you expect to see, that you can work with them. Finally, we'll just round it out with some resources for you guys. Again, you'll get the access to the slides later. This product, Webex for BroadWorks, has been rapidly changing. There have been lots of changes to the features that are available, lots of changes to how the XSPs should be tuned, procedures for turning things up, moving from mutual TLS to the CI token integration for the authentication service. All those kinds of things have been it's been a fairly rapid pace. What you can do to help stay on top of this is this button for subscribe to this article that's available on the articles that are part of the Cisco ecosystem. One challenge here is that not all of the documents that you want to be aware of are in the help.webex ecosystem. There are some documents that are still in BroadSoft Exchange, and I think that's definitely something to be aware of. that they're spread out between the two. And generally it makes sense why one is in one place and one is in the other. But I'll give you some of those here. The Webex for BroadWorks Solutions Guide is probably your go-to, kind of your main place to go for how to set this up and how to keep it running. The Webex for BroadWorks Configuration Guide is a separate document that is on Exchange. And so this is the Webex for BroadWorks Solution Guide is in general, everything that you need to know for turning it up, except for how to configure the clients. If you want to know how to configure the clients, you're in the Webex for BroadWorks Configuration Guide. Information about the tags and what each tag does and how that affects the behavior of the clients. That's this guy right here, the configuration guide. This URL, unfortunately, this is per version, per client version. So the URL might be outdated next month, but get on Exchange to find the right version that you need. This is telling us, again, how to configure the clients. There is a page about what's new in Webex. This keeps you up to date in the features, and then kind of gives you a hint as well on what you're going to have to do to configure them to get them working. As new features roll out, your users are going to be made aware of those features, or at least have the opportunity to learn about new features. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we as service providers have done the necessary configurations to make them work on the back end. Like, doesn't mean that we have updated the templates or updated the tag sets to get them to work in the way that needs to happen to integrate with our BroadWorks platform. So it really is important that you're paying attention to the releases and what's coming, and looking at the configuration guides as they come out to understand and know, okay, so for this new feature, I'm going to need to update my templates and configure particular tags or customize the templates in a certain way to get it to work with my platform. So it's, again, what we need to do to be on top of the Cisco release schedule and what's going on there to keep track of that. Webex does give us release notes. Like most release notes, I almost don't include these in the key articles and documents section. They're mildly helpful, but just like every other release note in the world, or most of them, I think the most important thing here is what I was talking about earlier, which is looking at the configuration guides and seeing updates there where new features are rolled out, and the configurations are for those new features are outlined in the configuration guides. And then we've got this document for updating BroadWorks NPS to use NPS proxy. This is, I mentioned this one earlier, but this is a key document if you need to migrate the legacy UC1 Connect Android apps from FCM to FCM v1. This outlines the intricacies of that process and how to navigate that. Like I said, an important thing here is to subscribe to these articles and to keep on top of them. You can get notifications and emails when they're updated. Look through the release history to be able to see what's changing so that you can keep up with it on your particular platform.
Thanks,
all right,
John.
That's what I have for today.
That's been great. Thanks for that presentation and for organizing those key points for us. We've got John's contact information here, and if you'd like to speak with Trevor, our account rep, who would be the right contact for a new project or just to get to know the company additionally, but you can certainly email John. We've got some questions, so we'll go through. You guys can feel free to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A as appropriate in the Webex, but we'll start off with one of the early questions that we got was, John, can you tell us about the general time frame for a Webex for BroadWorks deployment, and in particular, like, what's the long pole in a project plan? What are those things that are going to take the greatest amount of time that someone would want to watch out for?
Yeah, I mean, there's some things that that are out of your control. Like you need to be. There are two different spots in the process where you're going to be opening up TAC tickets to get OAuth trust relationships with Cisco in order to do NPS proxy and the Cisco CI for the authentication service. Generally, though, those I've seen Cisco be super responsive on those. I think for good reason. So while that's out of your control, I wouldn't say that that's going to be, or hopefully that's not going to be one of the long poles. I think that really the things that are going to is probably going to take the longest is stepping through the processes of, okay, I need to get my XSPs set up in a particular architecture. I need to figure out, am I going to work that? Am I going to have them behind a load balancer or directly on the internet? Getting the certificates all set up in the correct way and loaded in the right interfaces or system-wide, depending on how you're going to roll that out. And kind of stepping through all those various applications within the XSP that each have an integral role here, and getting all those configured up. There is actually a little bit of an order that you have to run through with those, and syncing that with the order is syncing the setup of those XSP applications with configuring the template and the clusters in Webex to then be able to start to provision your first users and get into the meat of, okay, do the clients act like they need to? Do they work with my SPCs? All that kind of stuff. So there's kind of a back and forth and a dance that you have to do there in order to get that set up in the right order. So I don't think that, all that to be said, there's not an obvious, well, this is the thing that's going to take the longest. You have to start this because it's going to take forever. I would say that it's a incremental walking through the process where there are dependencies that you're working through as you go through the solutions guide. I think in general, the solutions guide does a pretty good job of kind of preparing you, saying here are the concepts you need to be thinking about, here are the decisions you need to be making. But then as you get into it, you really see how it works. You're probably going to be changing some of those decisions and making it work in a slightly different way. So that's an incredibly vague and non-committal answer to what is the long pole, but that's just, I think, where it's at.
No, that's good. Thanks. And of course, as I said, you guys can, if you have any additional questions, feel free to type them in here. Another question here is in the Webex Partner Hub, you mentioned that there's a little bit of an association between, at least conceptually, between an enterprise and what they call a customer object in Webex. But is any of the information about the enterprise or groups, is that automatically synchronized in into the Webex platform? Or you
what
could say,
information are you thinking of?
Well, the identity of an enterprise, for example, like when you create a new enterprise, does that let's say you're using flow through, does that automatically create a new customer object in Webex?
Yes, yeah, I do believe that it does. I'd have to go back and look at as you're, where exactly that happens, or if you have to go and manually change the names or things like that. But yeah, there is that's the idea, is that as a service provider for your customers, as they are getting provisioned, however they're getting provisioned through those various methods, there is a customer organization that is getting created with that first user from that enterprise that's getting created through whatever provisioning method you have. And so once you get that first user in there, then the customer org is created, and you can start to manage it in that way.
You mentioned the calling behavior, that you needed to change the default calling behavior so that you're not using Webex Teams calling by default, but that there's each time you create a new customer, it would seem that you've probably got to go back and change that. Or is that a best practice that when a new customer is created, you would have to log in and change it, or are there any kind of template or default overriding default capabilities that you've been able to make use of?
I honestly can't remember if that's in the template, or I believe it's in the customer organization. So you would have to change that each time. I Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, if there's a way around that, as each customer is created. We can follow up on that and find
Okay.
out and let everybody know. That's a great question.
Sure. Another question is, you mentioned a couple of options that both seemed reasonable. You seemed comfortable with both flow-through provisioning and user self-activation. Obviously, they can't self-activate if their BroadWorks user is not built out. Can you talk about pros and cons, where you would see maybe flow-through being kind of a better fit, and where would you see self-activation being a better fit?
I think flow through provisioning is going to give you a little bit more control over the process, rather than a self-activation link that's hanging out there. And I think it's a little bit more likely to be a positive user experience too. It requires a little bit more work on the service provider's part, because you have to go in and add the integrated IM&P service and make sure that the email is in the correct place and all that kind of stuff. But it's I believe, I'll have to check on this too, but I believe that it is also required for things like single sign-on as well. And so if you're looking to use single sign-on, I don't think that user self-activation is an option, but I could be wrong on that. I could be misremembering that. But yeah, I mean, it's going to, I think it's more likely, the flow through is more likely to be it's more likely to avoid negative user experiences where folks say, well, my friend over here, he got this, he's with XYZ Telecom, and he has this link that allowed him to get the Webex apps, and he's got his phone number on the Webex apps. And so, hey, I'm going to use that link too. Well, that particular user isn't set up correctly, or doesn't have all the fields set up correctly in order to be able to use Webex and have that connection made through the authentication service. They're going to have a negative experience. They're going to try the link and it doesn't work for them. And so flow through is going to be a little bit more positive, a little bit more control, a little bit more, just a little bit more high touch to try to make sure the customer experience is good.
Gotcha. So another question: if you had a BroadWorks system of your own, let's say you're an enterprise. I know this is really common in the public sector space, that you're an organization and you have basically a BroadWorks application server cluster of your own. And so in some of these cases, you might only have one enterprise, BroadWorks enterprise, created inside that. Within that application server cluster, that's one enterprise that anybody actually uses for production service. Would that show up in Partner Hub as just one customer object? And are there any kind of downsides that you would anticipate around having, a limited number, one customer like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to show up as one customer in Partner Hub. I don't know of ways to split it out. They may be there, and I just don't know of them. So I think that that's going to have the limitations that you would have within a BroadWorks enterprise as well, where things like you're going to be able to see all of the directory entries for everyone in that enterprise. If you have directory sync turned on, you're going to have those connections, like Webex calling, Teams, all those kinds of things are going to show up for that particular customer organization. So that's definitely something to be aware of, that if they're all in the same enterprise, they're going to show up in that way.
Gotcha. Okay. So that one enterprise would reveal itself in a very parallel way as one customer object in Webex world, but it doesn't sound like that's a substantial downside from what you're saying. You're basically going to have the same kind of visibility in Webex that you would have in the BroadWorks space.
I think it's fairly analogous, yeah.
Another question is on the Webex for Teams calling. Did you have any situations so far where you've needed to go back and look at the history of Webex Teams calls? Is that something visible in the same way? On a BroadWorks system, you could look at access logs, you could look at CDRs, you may have, enhanced call logging. So you've got ways of keeping records of these logs. You may have a packet capture system, OCOM or something like that, where you can see these logs. Is there anything analogous like that? Like, oh, maybe that call routed through as a WebEx team call. Let me go look and see a history of that calls. Has that been something you've worked with at all?
Very little, no. It was very quickly saying, hey, we want these calls to route through BroadWorks. We don't want them to stay in the WebEx cloud. And so I do believe there are troubleshooting aids on the calls level. I just don't have very much experience with what kind of detail and how much troubleshooting you can do as a partner.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, that's legit to figure that out if you're choosing to leave the WebEx calling on for your users.
Right. Now you mentioned
in Control Hub, there is a section where it's showing, I think in one of the slides it showed a little bit of it, where it's showing the WebEx platform up status, whether it's having issues or whether there are any elements of the WebEx platform that are currently in an outage or anything like that. And so they're trying to expose some of that to partners. They're trying to help us understand if there's a problem with with a messaging session or with a team, messaging between a team, what could possibly be causing that, and trying to expose some of that to us, which I think is good. Yeah, I'm not sure on the logs specifically how useful that, how much useful information we could get from that in Control Hub.
Gotcha. So drilling down just a little bit more, this may be our final question, unless another one comes in. But couple of things, I think probably these really qualifies as two questions. On the XSP, you talked a little bit about mutual TLS and Cisco identity, the Cisco CI setup. Are those two alternative things? Do you do one or the other, or really both of those? Are those two things you set up both of those?
For the authentication service, for the authentication service, it is one or the other. Within Partner Hub, as you're setting up the cluster, either the cluster or the template, it's one or the other. You have the choice and to choose which type of authentication method you want to use.
Okay, and so the mutual TLS there, just from my understanding, the mutual TLS there is about identifying the BroadWorks service provider to Cisco, so that you'd have client certificates that are sent from the XSPs into Cisco's network. Is that the mutual TLS that's at play here?
I do believe so. Yeah.
Okay.
It's been a while since I've played around. It was maybe 4 or 5 months ago that the switch was made to the CI token as the recommended way. So I'm a little fuzzy on that.
Gotcha. Okay. So that's not, so TLS is not the current.
You know what? No, I think, I think it's actually I think it is the opposite. You're downloading the keys from, you're downloading you're downloading the certs from Cisco and installing those on your XSPs. And so it's Cisco authenticating against your XSPs. Fairly confident on that when I am thinking back through that process.
Okay, so it's really that when Cisco needs to prove, the Cisco servers need to prove who they are to your XSPs for those HTTPS connections back. Gotcha.
I believe so, yeah.
And then this is the second half of that, so probably the last question, unless another one comes in. The NPS proxy setup, you mentioned that process of setting up the NPS proxy. You mentioned a couple of things related to that. Can you give us a little bit more high level on kind of that NPS proxy setup? And what are some of the big things to be done there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is dependent on what your current setup is, and so it's going to change depending on whether you are fairly greenfield and you don't have you don't have apps that are branded and have keys loaded up into your NPS currently. I'm guessing that most service providers do. There are steps, like pre-steps, that need to be set up in order to get the. I mentioned the FCM to FCM v1. That's a real key one to find out where you are with that and to walk through that process because it's not easy. HTTP v1 for the APNS stuff is also required. And that's a pre-step that you need to make sure that you're doing. That's a much easier process to navigate on the APNS side. But it's setting those up to make sure that the protocols are up to date so that you can use the short-lived tokens in the NPS proxy. But then from there, it's fairly straightforward configuration to set up the Webex apps to use the NPS proxy architecture. And so it is, once you have the HTTP v1 and the FCM v1, once you have all of that set up and on kind of at the NPS system level, then it's going in and it's saying, all right, here is the application ID for FCM and for APNS for the Webex apps. I'm loading that into the XSP. And then along with that, I'm loading in the initial tokens and initial OAuth trust relationship, the key and the short-lived token to initiate that relationship with Cisco. And that's the part where that's one of the two places where you open up a Cisco TAC ticket to get those OAuth credentials from them. So you're loading those credentials in to the NPS XSP as you are, or right before you go and configure the applications. It's a term within the BW CLI for the XSP or the ADP for the NPS to then create that application that the NPS can use to use the short-lived tokens. So it's in the way that it's configured. It's configured in a different section within the NPS to get it to use NPS proxy versus the standard way of having the application keys loaded in.
Okay. Great.
So
well,
yeah,
that was helpful.
that's why that would probably be the main thing to remember and think about. And it's called out in the guide, so it's possible to miss it. But if you go in and start configuring things up, you're going to get to a spot pretty quick where you need the keys, the OAuth keys from Cisco to be able to initiate that that trust relationship with them. So you get stuck and you have to go make a Cisco TAC ticket to get those, and then you can continue on.
Great. Well, thanks, John, very much for your explanations and for answering all these questions. And we'll have these slides online, just like John said. You can get them from the ecg.co/webinars. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Feel free to shoot us an email, and I hope you all have a good week.